Welcome. In this lecture we are going to look at the development of plant taxonomy over time. As with any science, it's important to understand how the science developed by looking back at important role players. And in this context we are trying to see how classification systems also evolved over time to the ones that we are currently using. So we will look at different phases. So look at the top of the slide every time. And the first phase is that we'll look at is the ancient classification, really going back to the dawn of consciousness, where humans started gathering food and eating a variety of foods, so the hunter-gatherer culture. And in this context it was important to start distinguishing between useful plants, so food, medicine and other things that plants were used for. In this context it's also then important for harmful plants, so if something poisons your friend or your family member, you should know not to eat that again. So although these were simplified systems, they often had an extensive knowledge and a sophisticated nomenclature. And these would also then over time develop into regional names for plants. So the real sophisticated classification systems that were written down started with the ancient philosophers. So Theophrastus is called the father of botany, and his system represents one of the earliest, and he was the first to write down a classification in a permanent and a logical way. And you'll see that these start with very small numbers of taxa, and they build up to where the entire plant kingdom was attempted by some people later on. So in this case, again, these very early classification systems, you should remember, still focused very much on use of plants. And you'll notice that many of the early people that were classifying plants were actually medical doctors. So again, the emphasis here is on use of plants, and the systems would be very artificial. Remember, we spoke about natural versus artificial classification systems. If you're unsure, revise the introductory lecture. But natural classification systems, ones that are based on real relationships between members of the plant that you are classifying. So he used obvious morphological characters and some cryptic ones to document plants. Secundus documented medicinal and agricultural facts. People were growing plants and developing horticulture. Dioscorides, you can see here, Greek physician or doctor, described medicinal properties of about 600 plants in the Materia Medica. Albert Magnus, his classification distinguished between monocots and dicots. So this is very interesting, because very early on people started to notice fundamental differences between plants. So those with flowers, those without, those that are monocots, those that are dicots, and those that are vascular and non-vascular. And Magnus's system reflects this quite well. So in this phase, I'd like you to know all of these people. In the coming up, in the phases coming up, I will highlight some people in those that are quite extensive. So the next important phase are the Herbalists, and this phase was really sparked due to developments during the Renaissance that had important impacts on science globally, but especially on taxonomy. So the discovering of the printing press. So it meant that people could start printing books and disseminating or sending these around the globe. And then improvements in navigation. People were exploring the earth. People like Christopher Columbus and many others went to new parts of the world and encountered there also then new plants and animals and things. So books in this way also then became widely distributed around the world, meaning that people could start sharing knowledge across the world. So the first books were really medical reference books or herbals within the field of taxonomy. But these were really beautifully done. They had beautiful illustrations that could help people to facilitate identification, and they often had color, as you can see here. The Herbalists described medicinal and agricultural value of plants, so again very much focus on use and less so on science, and not much thought was given to the classification. Species were arranged in artificial ways or often alphabetically, and normally very few species, fewer than 100, were described. So some of the famous herbalists are Otto Brunfels, who wrote Herbarum Viviae Iconis, Jerome Bock, a new Crater book, Leonard Fuchs for the Historia Stirpium, and Matthias de la Oebel for Crate book. Again, here I want you to know all of these. So now the early taxonomists, this now was sparked after this herbalist phase, when other than books we had plant material that was being moved between the new and the old world. So right out at the start here, I want to highlight that you'll see that the early history of taxonomy has a very strong colonialist history, because the Western world obviously had the means and the money and other things to explore the world, and therefore many of the big people that made an impact in the field were from these colonial countries. This is not to say that we don't have a rich local knowledge and culture. We have 11 official languages, and very many distinct cultures in the country that use plants in different ways and have their own names for plants, etc. But this course does not focus on ethnobotany, it focuses on the history of taxonomy at this stage. So we are just going to focus on this. But in this exchange between plants around the world, people became aware of the diversity of plants on Earth and the need to arrange these in an orderly way. And that is then what people set out to do. We have Andreas Cesalpino, an Italian. He's regarded as the first true taxonomist, as he arranged plants on the basis of intrinsic characters rather than just practical value. So you can see this is in strong contrast with the herbalists and the ancient classification systems that really only focus on practical value. He also accepted that some characters were more important than others, and in De Plantis he described about 1500 species, and also some family concepts that he developed, Brassicaceae and Asteraceae, are still in use today. You'll get to know these during the practicals. Bowen was a Swiss person who wrote the Pinax in short, described about 6,000 species known at the time, also including synonyms. So remember that now with different people working in different parts of the world and plant materials being sent up and down, obviously you would have this different people giving the same plant names. And when we look at nomenclature, we'll discover how we decide what the correct name of a plant is. But in any case, these different names that are given to the same plant are synonyms. What's interesting about Bowen's work is that binomial nomenclature was applied to some extent. We then have John Ray, who was British and made an important contribution to theoretical botany, and published Methodus Plantarum Nova and Historia Plantarum, but he still used phrase names. And then Tournefort's a French person who wrote Institutionis Rei Herbariae, and you can see quite a large volume of plants, 9,000 species in 698 genera and 22 classes. So here you can see the appearance of higher hierarchies in the classification. So the systems in many of these were still artificial to some extent, but quite useful. So over here I want you to know especially Andrea Cesalpino. Then probably one of the most important eras is the era of Linnaeus. So Linnaeus I want you to know in detail as we go forward. So here is Linnaeus's very famous work, the Species Plantarum. In the introductory lecture I highlighted this as the start of modern nomenclature. So Linnaeus was Swedish, and he is called the father of taxonomy of plants and animals, as I said, because he really developed the way that we name plants and animals with the binomial system. He was originally trained as a medical doctor, but had an interest in plants and became the head gardener for George Clifford, and he later became a professor at Uppsala. So he's the founder of modern plant taxonomy and modern nomenclature, and he had three very famous publications: Systema Naturae, Genera Plantarum, and then Species Plantarum. Species Plantarum of 1753 is by far the most important because that's the first time the binomial system was used consistently. Although he made such a massive contribution, he had a sexual system for classifying plants using only flower data. So his classification was completely artificial. So he assumed that because flowers are so important for reproduction in plants, reproductive organs should be more important than other characters. So although his system was artificial, it was very practical. In Genera Plantarum, he devised this system, and his system comprised 24 classes based on stamens and other floral organs. But as I said, by far his most important contribution is the binomial system. So as I've highlighted, that means that a species name comprises of two words, the generic name and the species epithet. And in Species Plantarum of 1 May 1753, this was consistently used for the first time. And when we do nomenclature in more detail, you'll see why this is important, this date. Because it is chosen as the starting point for botanical nomenclature, so the rule of priority started at this date. And Species Plantarum classified the 7,700 species known at the time, and it became very popular and widely used. But then we move on to Post-Linnaean Natural Systems, and here the emphasis is on natural. So people realize that Linnaeus' sexual system was artificial and that there are natural relationships between plants. And this started giving rise to the development of natural systems. So systems based on the idea of evolution and shared ancestry between plant groups. Michael Adamson promoted the idea that as many characters as possible should be used in the classification without considering some of them more important than others. So this is in contrast with Linnaeus' system that relied very heavily on reproductive organs. So he published Familias de Plantes and recognized 58 families. De Jesus wrote Genera Plantarum, and he divided the plant kingdom into three main groups: the Acotyledones, the cryptograms, Monocotyledones, or the monocots, and the Dicotyledones, the dicots and the gymnosperms. Also had 15 classes that are today recognized as orders, and 100 orders that are recognized as families today. And his system is regarded as the first modern classification system. Lamarck developed ideas on evolution further, and he is well known for his theories of evolution, which is also called Lamarckism. And his famous book is Encyclopédie Méthodique, where he elaborated on the system of de Gesù. So over here, de Gesù is the important one I want you to know. Then another important one that I would like you to know is de Candolle. He wrote a textbook on botany called Théorie élémentaire, in which the term taxonomy was explicitly used for the first time. He followed the ideas of de Gesù and showed tendencies towards a phylogenetic approach, and he wrote a book called Prodromus Systematis Naturalis Regni Vegetabilis, in which he set out to revise all the plants of the world in 1816. This is obviously a mammoth time, especially in those years where it was difficult to get around. It often took months to travel from one area to another. So his grandson and his son also made contributions later on. The project completely outlived de Candolle. The first 17 volumes were published to cover the dicotyledons, so 58,000 species and 161 families. But unfortunately the project was never completed. The cryptograms and monocots were not done. But still a huge contribution, which is why I want you to know de Candolle. Bentham and Hooker then developed ideas of natural classification further in the early 1800s. Most important book is the Genera Plantarum, and this was based largely on de Gesù and de Candolle's work, and they divided the dicots into three groups: those with free petals, polypetally; the fused petals, gamma petally; and then the monoclamidae, those without petals. So 200 families, 7,500 or so genera recovered. It was at that time several herbaria arranged their collections according to this system. The theory of evolution then of Darwin and Wallace had an important impact on classification systems. So Darwin and Wallace very much at the same time introduced this idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest. So if you are not very familiar with Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace, you need to go and read up on those. So taxonomists aim to design these systems according to phylogenetic concepts, by arranging natural groups in a sequence of increasing complexity. Eichler was a German, and he was the founder of the first true phylogenetic system, published in Syllabus der Vorlesungen. So the cryptogamy was divided into several groups, including biophytes and ferns, and the seed plots divided into your gymnosperms and angiosperms, non-flowering plants and flowering plants. Angiosperms were then divided into monocotyledoni and the dicotyledoni, monocots and dicots. And within the dicots, two groups, those with free petals and those with fused petals, were recognized, but those without petals were placed in various parts of the system. Unlike Bentham and Hooker, there wasn't a distinct category for those. Then Engler and Prantl worked on a system published in Natürlichen Pflanzenfamilien, and they made several assumptions on which families are more advanced than others. And then in Das Pflanzenreich, an attempt was made to revise all the species of the world, but again it was never completed, because obviously this is a mammoth task. But their system became very important. So several large herbaria across the world arranged their system according to this, and it stayed this way until now, into the early 2000s. Delator and Harms published a numerical system to go along with these, giving genera and species numbers within Engler and Prantl's system. So this made cataloguing of herbaria far easier. So here I would like you to know Engler and Prantl especially. We then move on to phylogenetic classification systems that are move into the 20th century. Von Wettenstein. Here we started then with people anguishing with the monocots are older than dicots, or whether the monocots developed from within the dicots. So Engler placed dicots before the monocots. Basically the system based on the principle of evolution. And here we have an assumption on which characters are regarded as primitive and which ones are advanced. So the idea is that if a family has lots of primitive characteristics, it would be a primitive family, whereas those that have more derived or advanced characteristics would then be more younger families. Then phylogenetic systems, Hutchinson, Taxonomy, and Cronquist all made lots of contributions, mostly with the assumptions based on those of Bessie. And the assumptions were that the angiosperms had a monophyletic origin. We will get to monophyly in that shortly. And the dicots are basal or ancestral to the monocots. Magnoliaceae or related groups are basal to the angiosperms. And many floral parts is a primitive character. And simple flowers have originated through fusion and reduction of lots of floral parts, and these are all things that have later been shown to be true. Dahlgren proposed a new partly phylogenetic system based on phonetic characters, and we'll look at what the difference between phylogenetic and phonetic systems are. It differs from others in that it is unlikely that any extant or currently existing angiosperm developed from any other extant angiosperm, so that mostly all of the ancestors of the plants that we know today are extinct. And the characters used in classification came from a wide range of fields. So you'll see that when we look at phonetics, phonetics likes to include lots and lots and lots of different characters. So just to bring you up to speed with the two basic approaches to classify plants: the phonetic approach, which is numerical taxonomy, and then the phylogenetic approach, which is cladistic taxonomy. We'll highlight the difference between the two in upcoming lectures. These differ in their basic philosophy, and the results of both of these is a tree, as we call it in layman's terms, or in very plain language, but dendrograms is the fancy term for these. So these dendrograms are a two-dimensional representation of the taxonomic structure of a taxon. Remember, I explained to you earlier that those that sit closer together are more closely related than those that sit further apart. And a phenogram is a two-dimensional representation of the overall phonetic similarity. So this is the result of phonetic analysis, and the cladogram shows ancestral relationships usually reserved for the results of a cladistic analysis. Phylogenetic trees refer to hypothetical representations of ancestral relationships based on rigorous analyses. So both these phenograms and cladograms fall under the broad category called phylogenetic trees. Then closer to home, as you know that we had the Cape colony that formed when we had European explorers landing in the Cape, and with this we had lots of visitors to South Africa over time, and through this the very fascinating flora that we have here attracted the attention of discoverers, professional plant collectors, gardeners and botanists. And various people made contributions to explore and document our flora, and many of them, interestingly enough, were students of Linnaeus. So De Keyser, the first person who collected plants in the Cape, Heurnius illustrated and described a number of plants during a short visit. 10 of these later were used in books by Stapelius. Herman, he visited the Cape and made the first herbarium of local plants, so I'd like you to know Paul Herman. A small part of his collection formed part of a work by Bartholinus, and a list of 791 names of Cape plants compiled by Herman was later used by Berman in one of his publications. Then Ten Reyne visited the Cape in 1673. Part of his collection was donated to Reyne, whose book Exoticarum Plantarum Centuria Prima includes descriptions and illustrations of 48 Cape plants. So remember, in this at this stage, much focus was on the Cape Colony because that's where the people stayed. Not many people had explored the rest of the country. Gardens were established within the Cape Colony and head gardeners appointed. So Aldenland was the head of the gardens in Cape Town, and he would go out and collect natural plants and send them to Europe. Hartog later replaced Aldenland as the head of the gardens and continued sending material to Europe. Eckerberg was a Swedish captain who undertook 10 voyages to India and China, and they collected plants at the Cape and donated these to some very famous botanists such as Bergius and Linnaeus. Auger was the head of the gardens in the time of Rake Tilbach, and collection of his plants was purchased by Michael Grubb and became very famously known as the Grubb Collection, which was donated to Bergius in Stockholm and formed the basis of his famous work Descriptionis Plantarum ex Capita Bona Spei. Capita Bona Spei means the Cape of Good Hope. So here I would like you to know especially Herman and Auger. Then probably one of the most famous people that made a contribution to the knowledge on South African plants is Carl Thunberg. Definitely I would like you to know him. He was a student of Linnaeus, often regarded as the father of South African botany, and he started exploring the interior of South Africa through 3 large trips that he did between 1772 and 1775. He later succeeded Linnaeus as a professor at Uppsala, and his collection of plants formed the basis for Prodromus Plantarum Capensium. Complete descriptions and localities added in Flora Capensis, which was completed in 1823, which was his most famous work, and represent the first comprehensive book on the Cape Flora. Mason was a gardener at Kew, and he was sent to the Cape to collect living plant and herbarium specimens. And then Burchell is the second one here that I'd like you to know. He was also British, visited South Africa between 1810 and 15, and his voyages to the interior covered new territory not previously explored. So the focus here again is not on the Cape but on the rest of South Africa. He was very meticulous, John Burchell, so he would catalogue plants in a very meticulous way, and his herbarium specimens that he made from these voyages are very meticulously labelled and correspond very much to the books that he wrote. His collections are considered to be the largest African collection ever to be brought to Europe by a single collector. So very, very important collection. Then Ekelon and Zeyer were German collectors who collected large numbers of specimens in South Africa, and they would then sell these on to other people. They also wrote their own classification in the Enumeratio, which we call it for short, published in 3 parts between 1835 and 1837. Then Dresch is an important person that I'd like you to know. Professional collector regarded as the father of South African plant geography. So Dresch's focus was not necessarily so much on the classification, but more on where plants were found. He realized that there were distinct communities of plants across South Africa and across the world for that matter. And this is a very early understanding of biomes that we have in South Africa and across the world. So he undertook long voyages, collected lots of plant specimens, which he gave to Ernst Mayr for his publication, the Commentary Wurm, we call it in short. But Dresch's main contribution was in plant geography and zwei Pflanzen geographische Dokumente, where South Africa was for the first time divided into broad phytogeographic regions, which are really the predecessors for biomes in the country. So I'd like you to know Dresch, and I'd also like you to know William Henry Harvey, who worked as the colonial treasurer in the Cape between 1835 and 1842. And he published Genera of South Africa, and the first this was the first important book to be published locally. So you can see here the development of science in the country, and also the printing press. And then he joined forces with Sonder to produce a comprehensive work on the flora of the Cape Colony and Natal, called the Flora Capensis. And this project again outlived Sonder and Harvey, and it continued after his death by Thistleton Dyer until 1933. And then it was taken over by what we call the Flora of Southern Africa project, which ran deep into the 1990s. So quite a legacy that Harvey left in the country.